With the release of Vista, Windows has set a new precedent, and shiny is in right now. What I want to do right now is show you how to create a shiny button, one that is in the spirit of the look and feel of the rest of Windows Vista. The trick is to use a gradient that mimics the reflection of light off of a shiny surface, in this case our button. And this trick that I'll show you is something that you can use for a button, or you could use it for other controls, or really any situation where you want to create a reflection, something that looks shiny. A quick disclaimer. There isn't necessarily a right way to do this. And the technique I'm going to show you here is just the approach that's worked for me. As we go through it, I'll try to explain the why in addition to just showing you how it was done. Another thing is I want to show you all of the details along the way, because this is real world. This is the way that I would actually create this effect in my own applications or in an application for a client. Alright, so if you open up project files on the desktop and look in Chapter 7, you'll see that there are two folders in here. The first of these is Begin, and this is a starting point for the project that we're going to walk through. Now if you want, you can just watch the screen and follow along, because I've also created an end copy, and this is the final version of the project. And so even if you don't take the time to recreate every step, you have a working version of the end product. So go ahead and double click on Begin to open up that folder. And in there is a folder called Shiny. And in Shiny is the Visual Studio solution. So go ahead and double click on that to open it up. Now let's go ahead and maximize the window and close the error list so we have the full screen available to us. And now if you open up window1.xaml, you can see that I've created some boilerplate code. So this is just a very, very basic control template for a button. And we'll use this as a starting point for creating our shiny button. Let me go ahead and show you what this looks like right now. Alright, so you can see we have just one rectangle with some rounded corners, and then a place to display the text, which you'll see in the template is a content presenter. Let me show you that. So here's the boilerplate code for our button template. You can see that we've got a style, and we haven't set a key. Instead we're using the implicit key, which means this gets applied to all buttons. And then we're using setters to set a number of properties. And these are properties that I've already described to you, but let's go ahead and look at them again, just as a review. First of all, we're setting the overrides default style property to be true. Setting this property to true means that the style will not take on characteristics from the default style or the system style. I've also set snaps to device pixels to be true, and doing that ensures that whatever content we create will line up on actual pixel boundaries on the monitor where this is being viewed. I've also set the foreground property to white, and that's why the text was white. And then last of all is the template property, and this is where we'll be spending some time. Now if you scroll down just a little bit, you can see where we actually create the button. So here's our button, and you can see I've given it a width and a height and set the content property, but that's all I've done. The other thing to notice is I've set a layout transform on the grid to scale our button up by 2 times. I did this so that as we go through this process you can really see the detail of the button that we're creating. Of course this isn't necessary for the button to work. I just did this so we don't miss anything along the way. Alright, so scroll back up and take a look at the control template. Right now this template is really simple. You can see that we just have a single border and we've set its background to black, and I've set the corner radius property to 4. And then inside of that we have a content presenter, and I've used the vertical and horizontal alignment properties to center that within the border. Now the way I like to compose visual effects using XAML is by using layering. And this is easy in XAML because of the fact that every single color has an alpha component to it. And that makes it possible to layer colors and gradients one on top of another to create interesting effects. And that's exactly how we're going to create the reflection effect. Now to do that you need a number of layers to appear one on top of another, and I think the best way to do that is to use a grid. So the first thing I want to do in this control template is add a grid. Let's go ahead and do that as the top level element of the control template. And then of course we want all of the content to be inside of that grid, so go ahead and move the end tag down to the bottom. Now remember, a border can only have one child, and in this case we've made the content presenter that one child. But because we're putting the border in a grid, it's no longer necessary for the content presenter to be a child of that border. Let's flatten out this hierarchy a little bit and move the content presenter down so it's no longer a child of that border. This isn't absolutely necessary, but I think it makes it a lot easier to see the hierarchy of the control if we keep it really flat. And now because the border no longer has any children, we can go ahead and remove that end tag and just close it up and make it one tag. The other advantage to doing that is it allows us to interact with that border on its own. If we were to, say, set the opacity on that border later on to accomplish some effect, that would have the effect of changing the opacity on the content as well. And so keeping elements on their own like this allows us a lot more flexibility later on. Let me point out one other thing. This border, because it no longer has any content, could probably just be a rectangle. And a rectangle might be slightly lighter weight than using a border. I'm going to go ahead and use a border here though because I think it's a little bit easier to work with. And we've been using border in other places, so we're more familiar with the properties on border. Also, let's give this border a name in case we want to interact with it later on. I'm going to call this background border because this will be the background for the entire control. Now before I give it a name, I want to insert a comment so I can keep track of where background border is later on. Eventually our XAML will get pretty long, and having these comments will make it much easier to read and find things within the file. Now notice that I use the x:name property here. In most cases, name and x:name are interchangeable. The only time that this really comes into play is if you're giving a name to something that you created in the same project where you're naming it. In other words, if this were a custom control in the same project, I would have to use the x:name property. Because they're generally interchangeable, except that x:name sometimes has a slight advantage, I try to make it a habit to always use x:name instead of just name. Now like I mentioned, we want to create our reflection effect by adding another layer. So to do that, we can just add another border. We want the reflection to appear on top of the background border. And so to make sure that it's on top, it's important that we insert the new element after this one. And that's because the elements will be rendered in the same order that they appear here. In other words, background border will be rendered first, and then whatever comes after it. So go ahead and insert a new border, and we'll give it the name highlight border. First of all, let's insert a comment so we can easily find this later. And now add the border with the name highlight border. We don't need to set the background property yet, but we do want to give it the same corner radius as the background border. And now for the background, we want to use a linear gradient brush, and to do that, we'll need to use the complex property syntax like this. Remember, this lets us set the background property using a more complex object than a simple color.